I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Ethan talking in his sleep, murmuring nonsense in that half-conscious way kids do when they drift between dreams and waking. But as I lay there, heart pounding in the quiet darkness, I realized something was wrong. The voice wasn't coming from his room. It was coming from somewhere closer. I turned my head toward the doorway, toward the hallway where the faintest sliver of light stretched across the floor from Ethan's slightly open door. And that's when I saw it, his shadow. He was standing in front of his mirror. His body was completely still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if he were straining to listen. And then, he whispered again. Not in the soft, aimless way of someone lost in sleep, but in the careful, deliberate tone of someone answering a question. Something about the way he spoke made my stomach twist. It was the pauses. The way he would wait, nodding slightly, before murmuring his next words. The way his voice dipped so low I couldn't quite make out what he was saying. The way it sounded like he was having a conversation. Then, suddenly, Ethan laughed. A quiet, breathy little chuckle. And the moment I heard it, a sickening wave of cold washed over me. Because his reflection hadn't moved. Not a single inch. Ethan had laughed. But his reflection, his perfect, mirrored twin, had not. I must have made a noise, because Ethan's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide and alert, as if he had known I was there the whole time. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air between us thick with something I couldn't name. Then he smiled. You weren't supposed to see that, Mom. Now let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. Part 1, Just a Silly Game. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 2 weeks ago. Hey, everyone. I don't usually post here, but I need to get this out somewhere. Maybe I'm overthinking things. Maybe it's just normal teenage behavior. But my son has been acting strange. It started with something small, something I almost ignored. But now, I can't shake the feeling that something is off. It started a few weeks ago. Ethan, my 14-year-old, has always been a little quirky. He's a quiet kid, more into books than video games, always had a big imagination. So when I first noticed him sitting in front of his bedroom mirror for long stretches of time, I didn't think much of it. Kids do weird things, right? At first, it was innocent. He'd sit cross-legged in front of it, just staring. Not fixing his hair, not checking his face. Just looking. I teased him about it once, joking that he must have a crush on his own reflection. He just smiled, like I had no idea what I was talking about. Then he started whispering. I caught him one night when I was walking past his room. His door was slightly open, and the light from the hallway spilled in just enough for me to see him sitting there, inches from the glass, whispering so softly I couldn't make out the words. I asked him who he was talking to. He laughed and said, "It's just a game, Mom." I didn't push it. Kids have imaginary friends all the time. Maybe it was some kind of meditative thing, or just him being silly. But then the game changed. I noticed it about a week later. Ethan was sitting in front of the mirror, making slow, exaggerated movements, lifting his hands, tilting his head side to side. Like he was testing something. When I asked what he was doing, he shrugged and said, "Seeing if it will copy me." I laughed. That's what mirrors do, sweetheart. But he didn't laugh back. Instead, he frowned, like I had said something wrong, and muttered, "Not always." That's when I started feeling uneasy. Last night was the worst so far. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and, out of habit, peeked into his room to check on him. He was sitting in front of the mirror again, completely still. The light from his nightstand cast this weird, warped shadow across the wall. His face was inches from the glass, his breath fogging up the surface. I was about to tell him to go back to bed when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a handprint on the glass. A single, small handprint pressed against the mirror, right at eye level. But Ethan wasn't touching it. His hands were in his lap. I turned on the light. The handprint was gone. Ethan blinked at me, like he had just woken up from a dream. He looked confused for a second, then smiled. "It's okay, Mom," he said. "I won that round." I don't know why, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Maybe he put his hand on the mirror earlier, and I just didn't notice. Maybe it was some weird trick of the light. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever game Ethan is playing, he's not playing it alone. I'll update if anything else happens. Hopefully, I'm just being paranoid. Part 2, he says it talks back. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 10 days ago. Okay. I really didn't think I'd be back here, but things have gotten stranger. I told myself I was overreacting. That Ethan was just being a kid, playing some weird self-invented game. But the more I watch him, the more I realize this isn't just a game to him. It's real. A couple of nights ago, I heard him talking to the mirror again. Only this time, it wasn't just whispering. It was an actual conversation. I stood outside his door and listened. He would say something, then pause, like he was waiting for a response. Then he'd laugh. Not like a normal laugh, but this quiet little chuckle, like someone had just whispered a private joke in his ear. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation. Because, of course, there wasn't one. I finally stepped in and asked, "Ethan, who are you talking to?" He didn't even look startled. Just turned his head slightly and said, "You wouldn't get it, Mom." I sat on the edge of his bed, trying not to sound weirded out. What wouldn't I get? He finally turned to me, and I swear. I don't know if it was the lighting or just my own paranoia, but his eyes looked darker. Deeper, somehow. "You don't see it like I do." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and smiled, like I was the clueless one. That same night, I caught him playing rock, paper, scissors with his reflection. At first, I thought he was just being goofy until I saw his face. He wasn't playing like a kid amusing himself in the mirror. He was focused, like it was a serious competition. He held up rock, then nodded, like he was acknowledging a move I couldn't see. Then he lost. I know how stupid that sounds. Of course, he lost, he was playing against himself. But the way he reacted, he looked disappointed. Like he genuinely thought he had a chance to win. And the worst part? Right before he threw his move, his reflection's hand twitched first. I don't mean after, before. Like it already knew what he was going to pick. I didn't say anything at the time. I just watched him finish the game, shake his head, and mutter, "Best 2 out of 3. But I swear, his reflection was already holding up scissors before he even lifted his hand. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was a trick of the eye. Maybe I was just tired. But things are getting weirder. Yesterday, I walked into his room while he was at school to put some laundry away, and I saw 2 chairs facing the mirror. One for him. One for, what? And then today, when I picked him up from school, he barely said a word the whole car ride home. Just stared out the window, deep in thought. I finally asked, "Ethan, everything okay?" He hesitated. Then said, "Mom, what do you think happens if you break a mirror?" I told him the usual, bad luck, old superstition. He just nodded. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear, he said, "But what if something was trying to get out?" I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he didn't laugh back. He just stared at me. I don't know what to do. Is this some weird teenage phase? A mental health thing? Or something else? All I know is, I walked past his room just now and heard him whispering again. But this time, I swear to God, something whispered back. I'm not crazy, right? Someone please tell me this is normal. Part 3, The Rules Are Changing. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 7 days ago. I'm trying to stay rational. I really am. But I don't know how much longer I can pretend this is normal. Ethan isn't just playing with his reflection anymore. He's testing it. I caught him doing it yesterday. He was standing in front of the mirror, moving in slow, deliberate motions, raising his hand, tilting his head, lifting one foot off the ground, like he was waiting for something. At first, I thought he was just being silly. But then I realized he wasn't just watching himself. He was checking something. I asked him what he was doing, and without even looking at me, he said, "Making sure it still follows the rules." I laughed nervously. "What rules?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just stared at his reflection, tilting his head one way, then the other. Then he finally said, "You know, Mom. The rules of mirrors." I didn't like how he said it. Like I was the one being naive. This morning, I decided to test something myself. While Ethan was at school, I went into his room, stood in front of the mirror, and raised my right hand. My reflection copied me exactly, just like it should. Nothing weird. Nothing off. But then I tried something different. I dropped my hand behind me, out of sight. And my reflection hesitated. Not long. Just for a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible delay before it followed me. But I saw it. And now, I can't stop thinking, was it hesitating because it was copying me? Or because it was choosing to copy me? Then tonight happened. I was cleaning up after dinner when Ethan suddenly asked, "Mom, have you ever seen your reflection do something it shouldn't?" I almost dropped the plate I was holding. I forced a laugh. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Like, moving when you're not moving. Or looking at you when you're looking away." I told him no, of course not. That's not how mirrors work. He just nodded and said, "Yeah. I thought so too." Then he walked away, like that was the end of the conversation. But I know it wasn't. Because just now, I walked past his room and saw him sitting cross-legged in front of the mirror again, whispering. And this time, his reflection wasn't whispering back. It was watching. Completely still. Unmoving. Like it was waiting for something. Like it knew I was there. I backed away slowly, trying to tell myself I was imagining things. But as I turned to go back to my room, I heard Ethan say, softly, almost like he was reassuring someone, "Don't worry. She doesn't see it yet." I don't know who he was talking to. I don't want to know. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Please, has anyone experienced something like this before? Part 4, Something Else is in the Mirror. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 4 days ago. I don't know how to explain what I saw tonight in a way that makes sense, because I barely understand it myself. All I know is that I am afraid, truly, deeply afraid, for my son, for my home, for my sanity. And I need someone, anyone, to tell me that I am not imagining this. Ethan's game has changed again, and this time, I don't think he's the one in control anymore. 2 nights ago, I found him standing in front of the mirror long past midnight, his small bedside lamp casting eerie, elongated shadows across the walls. His reflection stood perfectly still, arms at its sides, staring back at him with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. At first, I thought he was just admiring his own image, lost in some teenage daydream. But then I noticed something that sent a sickening wave of cold through my entire body. Ethan was breathing. His chest rose and fell in slow, steady movements, his body shifting ever so slightly with each inhale and exhale. But his reflection, it did not move at all. Not a single breath. Not the faintest rise of his shoulders, not the slightest flicker of motion in his chest. It just stood there, rigid and motionless, like a photograph, like a hollow thing pretending to be him. I must have made a noise, a sharp intake of breath or a shuffle of my feet, because Ethan's head snapped toward me in an almost unnatural, too fast motion, his eyes wide with something I can only describe as irritation. "Mom," he said, his voice flat, as if I had interrupted something important. I forced myself to steady my voice, to keep it light, to act as though I wasn't on the verge of grabbing him and dragging him out of that room. "Sweetheart, it's late. You should be in bed." He blinked slowly, like he was processing the words one by one, then turned back toward the mirror. "Yeah," he murmured, almost too quietly for me to hear. "I was just finishing up." And then, only then, his reflection finally moved, exhaling a slow, shuddering breath as if it had been waiting for permission to do so. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab him, shake him, demand to know what the hell was going on, smash that mirror into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just nodded stiffly and backed out of the room, gripping the doorframe until my knuckles ached, and watched as Ethan climbed into bed without another word. I wanted to believe it was nothing. I wanted to believe I was just exhausted, paranoid, losing my grip. But deep down, something inside me knew that I had just witnessed something I was never meant to see. Last night, I finally decided that enough was enough. While Ethan was at school, I went into his room with an old bedsheet and covered the mirror completely, tucking the fabric securely around the edges so that not even the smallest sliver of glass was visible. I stood there for a moment afterward, staring at the covered shape, my heart hammering in my chest like a trapped animal. The room felt lighter somehow, as if I had shut something out, as if I had taken back just a tiny piece of control. But when Ethan got home, the moment he stepped through the front door, his entire body tensed. He didn't even say hello. He just stood there, sniffing the air like he could sense something was different. And then, without a single word, he walked straight past me, down the hall and into his bedroom. I followed after him as casually as I could, trying to suppress the prickling anxiety crawling up the back of my neck. I found him standing in front of the covered mirror, one hand slowly trailing over the fabric like he was memorizing the shape of the glass beneath it. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I swallowed hard. "I just thought it would help you sleep better. I know you've been spending a lot of time looking at yourself in the mirror lately. It's not healthy, Ethan." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Just stood there, fingers curled slightly into the sheet, shoulders stiff. Then, very quietly, he said, "It's not me that looks." A chill wrapped around my spine and squeezed. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Ethan tilted his head, considering, then shook his head as if dismissing the question. "It doesn't matter." He turned and walked out of the room without another word. I left the sheet on the mirror, too uneasy to remove it, too stubborn to let him win whatever silent battle we were fighting. But this morning, when I went to wake him up for school, the bedsheet was gone. Not crumpled on the floor, not tossed to the side. Just gone. As if it had never been there at all. And the mirror, perfectly clean, perfectly untouched, stood there, waiting. I don't know what's happening in my house, but I know one thing for certain: whatever is in that mirror, whatever has been playing this game with my son, it is not just a reflection anymore. And I am terrified that I waited too long to stop it. Has anyone else ever dealt with something like this? Please. I don't know what to do. Part 5, The Reflection Wants Out. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 2 days ago. There are certain moments in life where the air itself seems to shift, where reality bends just slightly, just enough to make you question the solidity of the world around you. I have always believed that mirrors are simple things, objects that serve a function, reflecting light and space back at us with no thought, no intention, no malice. But now, as I stand on the precipice of something I cannot explain, something that coils around my home like an unseen predator, I find myself questioning the very nature of glass, of reflection, of the thin, fragile veil that separates what we know from what we think we know. Something is wrong with the mirror in my son's room. And more disturbingly, something is wrong with him. Earlier today, I heard an unfamiliar sound echo through the hallway, a rhythmic knocking, deliberate and slow, each tap ringing out with an unnatural precision. At first, I thought it was Ethan, perhaps drumming his fingers absent-mindedly against his desk, but the sound wasn't coming from his room. It was coming from inside the mirror. As I stood outside his door, frozen in place, the knocking came again, 3 sharp, deliberate taps against the glass, too perfectly spaced, too measured, as if something on the other side wanted to be heard. My heart pounded violently in my chest as I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling against the cold metal, and when I finally pushed the door open, I was met with an unnatural stillness, an air so heavy and oppressive that my breath came shallow and quick. The mirror was there, gleaming, untouched, its surface smooth and unbroken. But as I took a hesitant step closer, I saw it, the unmistakable imprint of a hand pressed against the inside of the glass, the palm perfectly flat, the fingers splayed out as if something had been waiting, as if something had been watching. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, my legs felt rooted to the ground, but then, before I could will myself to move, the handprint began to slide downward, not fading, not smudging, but dragging, as if the unseen owner was slowly, purposefully sliding its fingers down the glass. The sensation that overcame me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt before, not just fear, not just the creeping chill of being confronted with the impossible, but something deeper, something primal. It was the sick, twisting realization that whatever was inside that mirror was not merely a reflection gone wrong, not merely an illusion of the mind. It was something else entirely. It was real. And it was trying to get out. When Ethan came home later that afternoon, he walked through the front door with an air of complete normalcy, his face relaxed, his posture casual, his voice light and unbothered as he greeted me. And yet, the moment I looked into his eyes, the moment his gaze locked onto mine with an unnatural stillness, I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea roll through me. He seemed wrong in a way that I couldn't immediately define, his movements too smooth, his expressions just slightly off, as if he were imitating the motions of a person rather than living them. I wanted to ask him about the mirror, about the handprint, about the knocking, but the words died in my throat, choked off by the creeping certainty that I was speaking to something that might not be my son at all. Instead, I forced a smile, swallowed my fear, and asked the only question I could manage without betraying my terror. "Ethan, do you ever feel tired?" He paused for just a moment, his head tilting ever so slightly, his lips parting in a slow, calculated grin, and then, in a voice that was both his and not his, he answered, "Sometimes." Then he turned, walked down the hall, and disappeared into his room, leaving me standing there, suffocated by the terrible certainty that whatever was in the mirror was no longer just watching. It had been waiting. And now, I fear, it has finally stepped through. Part 6, Which One Is My Son? Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 1 day ago. There are moments when you look at someone you love, someone you've known for years, and for just a second, just the briefest, most fleeting instant, you feel as though you are looking at a stranger. It is a horrifying sensation, one that digs into your ribs and wraps around your heart like a tightening coil, an unshakable, bone-deep instinct whispering that something is wrong. I have felt this with Ethan before, in small doses, in passing glances and lingering silences. But last night, for the first time, I felt it in its entirety, an overwhelming and inescapable certainty that the boy in my house, the boy sitting at my kitchen table, the boy sleeping in the room down the hall, is not my son. At dinner, Ethan sat across from me, his fork scraping against his plate with an unnatural slowness, the rhythmic movement mechanical, almost rehearsed. He ate without looking at his food, his gaze fixed on me instead, studying my face with an intensity that made my stomach twist painfully. He was waiting, I realized. Watching. Not for anything specific, not for conversation or for me to react, but for something deeper, something I could not name. Every time I spoke, his lips curled into a small, knowing smile, a fraction of a second before I had even finished my sentence, as if he already knew what I was going to say. I felt myself gripping my fork tighter, my knuckles whitening around the handle, my mind scrambling to rationalize, to come up with some kind of explanation that wasn't what I knew to be true. And then he laughed, soft, amused, like a private joke only he understood. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse a wild, erratic drumbeat against my ribs. "Why are you looking at me like that, he asked, his voice perfectly light, perfectly casual. But it was not a question. It was a warning. Later that night, I found myself standing outside his bedroom door, my fingers hovering just inches from the doorknob, my breath shallow, my entire body locked in a paralyzing war between fear and urgency. I don't know what I was expecting to find, what I thought I would see when I stepped inside, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I needed to see it. And so, moving as quietly as I could, I eased the door open and peered into the dimly lit room. Ethan was asleep, his body curled beneath the covers, his breathing deep and steady. But the mirror was uncovered again. The smooth, gleaming surface stretched across the room like an open wound, swallowing what little light remained. And then, as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw it. The reflection was standing up. Ethan was in bed, motionless beneath the blankets, but his reflection stood just inside the glass, upright, staring directly at me. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't mimic the slow rise and fall of his breath. It only watched. And as I stood there, frozen, every inch of my body screaming at me to run, its lips curved into a small, slow, knowing smile. I don't remember leaving the room, don't remember how I ended up in my own bed, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely grip the sheets around me. But I do remember what happened this morning, when Ethan came downstairs, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, greeting me with a soft, groggy, "Morning, Mom." His voice was light, casual, normal. But when I looked at him, I didn't speak. I couldn't. Because now, in the bright, unforgiving light of day, I could see it, his reflection was still smiling. Even when his face was blank. Even when he looked away. Even when I blinked and forced myself to glance at anything but the mirror. His reflection was still smiling. And I know, that whatever was in there, whatever had been waiting so patiently, had finally gotten what it wanted. The game is over. And I have lost. Part 7, The Bargain. Posted by you/mom on edge, 12 hours ago. I no longer feel safe in my own home, no longer feel as though I belong within these walls that have sheltered me for years. There is a presence here, something unseen but undeniable, something that lingers in the empty spaces between shadows and breathes in the silence of the night. I feel it watching me, pressing against me, filling the air with a weight so thick I can barely breathe. But the worst part, the part that turns my blood to ice every time I so much as glance in his direction, is that my son, or at least the thing that calls itself my son, seems perfectly, eerily at peace with it. He moves through the house with a strange ease now, as if he has settled into a skin that does not quite fit, as if he is learning, adapting, becoming something I do not recognize. And I, powerless and afraid, can do nothing but watch as my real son, my real Ethan, remains locked somewhere I cannot reach. I have spent the past several hours combing through every book, every online forum, every half-whispered legend I can find about mirrors, about reflections, about the possibility that what we see in the glass is not always what it seems. I have read about cultures that cover their mirrors during times of grief, fearing that the soul might become trapped within them. I have learned of myths that speak of something else lurking beneath the surface, something waiting for the right moment to step through. But none of it tells me how to bring him back. And so, in desperation, I did something I never thought I would do. I spoke to it. I waited until Ethan, or not Ethan, was out of the house, and I stood before the mirror, staring at my own reflection until my vision blurred, until my heart pounded so hard I thought it might crack open my ribs. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, I asked, "Where is my son?" At first, there was nothing but silence, an absence so profound it rang in my ears. But then, slowly, the reflection changed, not in a dramatic, supernatural way, not in some grotesque, horror movie fashion. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. The room behind my reflection seemed to darken, as if the light within it was being swallowed, and then, just for a moment, I saw movement. A shape. A flicker of something just beyond the glass. And then I heard it. Not a voice, not words exactly, but something deeper, something older, something that was not meant to be heard by human ears. It slithered beneath my skin, wrapped itself around my bones, and filled my mind with a single, chilling truth. I had let it happen. I had waited too long. And now, the only way to bring my son back was to trade places with him. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the void that had once been nothing more than a simple bedroom mirror. But I do know that when I finally stepped away, when I finally gathered the courage to break free from whatever held me in place, I felt something shift behind me. A whisper of movement, a breath of air that should not have been there. And when I turned around, Ethan was standing in the doorway, watching me. His head tilted ever so slightly, his lips curling into that same too smooth, too knowing smile. "Talking to yourself, Mom?" he asked, voice light, amused, filled with something I could not name. And I, throat tight, hands trembling, forced myself to smile back. "Of course," I said, my voice barely steady. "Just lost in thought. Because the truth is, I am lost. Lost in something I do not understand, something I cannot fight. And now, as I sit here, typing these words with shaking fingers, I know the decision I have to make. I have to go back to the mirror. I have to make the trade. Because if I don't, if I fail, then whatever is standing in my son's skin will never leave." Part 8, The Last Reflection. Posted by you/Mom on Edge, 1 hour ago. I do not know how to describe the feeling of standing before the thing that has taken your child, the thing that wears his skin, speaks with his voice, moves with his gestures, but is not, cannot be him. It is a horror that goes beyond fear, beyond grief, beyond any human emotion that has a name. It is the sensation of staring into an abyss that is staring back, of realizing that the person you have loved and raised and nurtured has been hollowed out and replaced with something other. And yet, as I stood before the mirror tonight, the terrible truth pressing against my ribs like an iron weight, I knew that I had only one choice left. I had to bring Ethan back. I had to make the trade. And I had to do it before whatever was standing in my house, living in my house, decided it no longer needed to pretend. I don't know how I found the strength to speak, how I managed to force my voice past the lump of dread lodged in my throat, but somehow, I did. I stood before the mirror, my hands pressed against its cold, unyielding surface, my own reflection staring back at me with dark, depthless eyes, and I whispered the words that felt both foreign and inevitable, "Take me instead." The moment the words left my lips, the air around me shifted, thickened, as though the very walls of the room were holding their breath. The glass beneath my palms became warmer, almost pulsing, as if it were alive. And then, as though the reflection itself had been waiting, watching, for me to surrender, it moved, not as a mere mimicry of my actions, but of its own volition. Its hand reached out, its fingers grasping mine, and before I could pull away, before I could even think to scream, the world around me shattered. It was not like falling. It was not like being pulled. It was like being turned inside out, like being peeled away from the world I had always known and thrust into something beneath it. Darkness swallowed me whole, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin with an unbearable weight, and for a moment, I was certain I was dying. Then, through the void, I saw him, Ethan. His face was pale, his expression one of confusion and terror, his eyes darting wildly as if he had only just realized where he was. He reached for me, his fingers trembling, and I tried to reach back, to pull him forward, to push him through the glass before it was too late. But as our hands brushed, something cold and wrong wrapped around my wrist, yanking me back. A presence, unseen but undeniably there, holding me in place, whispering in a voice that had no sound. And then Ethan was gone. He was gone, and I was still here. But the mirror, it was not the same. I was no longer staring into the reflection of my own room. I was staring at my house, my life, my world, but from the other side of the glass. I saw Ethan stumble backward, gasping for breath, his hands shaking as he clutched at his own chest, as though he had just been pulled from drowning. I saw him look around in confusion, then slowly, hesitantly, his gaze lifted to the mirror. To me. And when he saw me, when his eyes finally locked onto mine, his face twisted in horror, in disbelief, in the slow, dawning realization that his mother was now on the wrong side of the glass. He opened his mouth, he screamed, and then he ran. He ran from the room, from the mirror, from me. And now I am here, in this endless reflection, in this hollow, silent place, trapped behind the glass that no longer belongs to me. I don't know if he will come back. I don't know if he will remember. But I know this, when he does return, when he stands before this mirror again, when he looks upon his own reflection, I will be waiting. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with new stories. I also look forward to your comments, criticisms, and suggestions below this video.